The knife was already at her throat when Elira Voss stopped breathing. She had not screamed. She had learned long ago that screaming only made things worse in the Blackthorn camp, so she stood still in the mud behind the old grain house, feeling the cold edge press against her skin, and she waited for the man holding it to decide whether tonight was the night he finally went too far. "Wolfless girls don't get to say no," Garrick hissed into her ear. His breath smelled of stale ale and old anger. "You don't have a wolf inside you to protect you. You don't have claws. You don't have fangs. You have nothing, Elira. So stand there and be quiet, like the nothing you are." Elira's heart slammed against her ribs, but her face stayed calm. She had trained herself for years to keep her face calm, even when her whole body wanted to shake apart. It was the only weapon a wolfless girl had. Never let them see you break. "Let her go, Garrick." The voice came from the shadows near the fence line, low and even. Elira's younger brother, Callum, stepped out with a wooden staff gripped in both hands, his knuckles pale, his 16-year-old shoulders squared like he actually believed he could win a fight against a grown shifter twice his size. Garrick laughed, but the knife eased back a fraction of an inch. "Your little brother wants to be a hero," he said. "Cute. Won't matter in 3 days, when the king arrives, and everyone in this pack remembers exactly what you are, Elira. A blank space where a wolf should be. A mistake somebody forgot to correct." He shoved her hard into the mud and walked off laughing, boots splashing through puddles, leaving her kneeling in the cold with her brother's hand already reaching to pull her up. "I had it handled," Elira said, though her voice shook as she said it. "Sure you did." Callum wiped mud from her cheek with his sleeve, his young face tight with worry he was trying to hide. "One of these days, Elira, someone in this pack is going to hurt you, and nobody is going to stop it in time." "Nobody's stopped it my whole life," she said quietly. "Why would today be different?" They both knew the truth. Neither of them said out loud. Elira Voss had been born into a pack of shifters, a bloodline of wolves stretching back centuries, and yet no wolf lived inside her. She could not shift. She could not hear the low hum of the pack bond that connected every other wolf in Blackthorn like an invisible thread of belonging. She was 18 years old and had spent her whole life as a ghost, standing in a crowd of family who would never fully claim her as one of their own. They called her wolfless, they called her worthless. Sometimes they called her both in the same breath, as if the two words had simply grown together over the years, until nobody could separate them anymore. She had a mother who did not look at her too long, because looking too long meant remembering the shame of birthing a daughter with no wolf. She had a father who had died 2 winters ago of a fever, the one person besides Callum who had ever told her she mattered. And she had a pack, if it could even be called that, who used her for the lowest work, scrubbing stone floors, hauling water from the river before dawn, mending torn cloaks with fingers so cold they bled, and who reminded her constantly that she should be grateful they let her stay at all. In 3 days, everything about Blackthorn would change, though Elira did not yet understand how much. King Draven Ashgrave, ruler of every Lycan pack across the Northern Territories, was traveling from settlement to settlement in search of a mate, not through courtship, not through arranged agreements between powerful families, the way lesser lords chose their wives. The Lycan king would choose through the choosing ritual, an ancient rite where a king's own wolf identified its fated match by scent alone, a bond that could not be faked, bribed, or denied. Every pack he visited erupted into chaos preparing for his arrival. Noble daughters were groomed for weeks. Families spent fortunes on silk and perfume, hoping their daughter's scent would somehow catch a king's attention, though everyone quietly understood that fate did not care about money. Elira understood this only from a distance, the way a beggar understands a feast happening behind a locked door. Wolfless women were forbidden from attending the choosing ritual at all. The law was old and absolute. A creature without a wolf could not participate in a bond meant for wolves. She would not even be allowed inside the hall except to serve wine in clear plates once the noble families had finished admiring themselves. "Maybe it's better that way," she told Callum that night, sitting by a small fire behind their shared cottage, the mud from Garrick's assault still drying on her sleeve. "I don't need to stand in a room and be reminded that I'm the only wolfless woman in 100 miles, while every other girl gets looked at like she might become a queen." "You could have been anything," Callum said, staring into the flames. If things were different. Things aren't different. Alira pulled her knees to her chest. They never have been. I stopped hoping for that a long time ago, Callum. Hope is expensive, and I can't afford it. She meant it when she said it. She had built her entire life around not hoping, because hoping had only ever led to disappointment sharp enough to cut. But even as she said the words, something small and stubborn stirred in her chest, a feeling she quickly buried, because feelings like that were dangerous for a girl like her. 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. The camp transformed from a tired, muddy settlement into something almost beautiful. Banners raised along the main path, the great hall scrubbed and polished. Every noble family parading their daughters in new gowns through the square, as if auditioning for a role that had already been written for someone else. Elira watched it all from the edges, invisible as always, carrying buckets and folding linens while girls her own age laughed and compared jewelry, none of them sparing her more than a curious glance before looking away, as if her presence embarrassed them. Lady Seraphine Vance walked past her twice that week, each time letting her silk skirts brush deliberately close to the mud Elira was scrubbing, a small cruelty disguised as an accident. Seraphine was the daughter of one of Blackthorn's most powerful families, beautiful in the effortless way that came from never having to work for anything, and everyone already whispered that she was the obvious choice. The only choice. The girl born to be a queen. Careful, Seraphine said the second time, not even bothering to look down at Elira kneeling on the stone floor. Wouldn't want the Wolfless girl to trip and embarrass herself in front of a king. Her companions laughed. Elira said nothing. She had learned that silence cost her nothing, while a response cost her everything. On the morning the king was due to arrive, Elira woke before dawn as usual, dressed in the plain gray servant's clothes she always wore, and reported to the kitchens to help prepare the feast. Steam rose from enormous pots. Cooks shouted orders. The whole hall buzzed with a nervous energy that made Elira's skin prickle, though she told herself it was only the heat from the ovens. By midday, the great hall filled with the noble families of Blackthorn, dressed in their finest, standing in careful rows like flowers arranged for display. Elira was given a tray of wine, and instructed to stay along the back wall, refilling cups only when signaled, speaking to no one, meeting no one's eyes. She had never seen so many important people gathered in one place. Pack elders in ceremonial furs, wealthy merchants who funded half the settlement. And at the center of it all, an empty space at the front of the hall where the king would stand, framed by 2 enormous carved wolves that had guarded that doorway for longer than anyone could remember. A horn sounded outside, low and resonant, and the entire hall fell silent. The doors opened. King Draven Ashgrave entered Blackthorn's great hall, and Elira felt every hair on her arms rise before she understood why. He was tall in a way that made the doorway seem smaller, dressed in black and deep gray, a fur-lined cloak thrown over broad shoulders that moved like a man used to carrying weight nobody else could lift. His hair was dark, cut short and severe. His eyes swept the room once, quick and assessing, the eyes of a predator counting exits even in a place meant to honor him. There was no warmth in his face, only a kind of controlled stillness that felt more dangerous than anger would have. The noble families bowed low. Seraphine Vance stepped forward from the front row, her golden gown catching the torchlight, her chin lifted with the confidence of a girl who had already decided how this story ended. Draven's gaze moved over her, polite, distant, unreadable. He moved down the row of daughters presented to him, one after another, pausing briefly before each, his expression giving away nothing. Elira watched from the back wall, her tray of wine growing heavy in her hands, feeling strangely relieved that none of this concerned her at all. She was simply staff, furniture with legs, a shadow along the wall that nobody in that glittering crowd would ever think to notice. And then, King Draven Ashgrave stopped walking. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the hall, his broad shoulders suddenly rigid, his head turning slowly, deliberately, away from the row of noble daughters, and toward the back wall where the servants stood. Toward Elira. The hall's murmur died into confused silence. Elira felt the weight of his gaze land on her like a physical thing, and her breath caught somewhere in her throat. She had spent her entire life being invisible, and in one single moment, Standing against a wall in her plain gray dress with a wine tray trembling in her hands, she became the single most visible person in the room. "You," Draven said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through still water. "Step forward." Nobody moved. Elira's mind raced through every possible reason a king might single out a wolfless servant girl, and none of the reasons that came to her were good ones. Had she done something wrong? Spilled wine on someone important? Been seen where she shouldn't have? "I said step forward," Draven repeated, and this time there was an edge in his voice that made even the pack elders shift uncomfortably. Elira set down her tray with shaking hands and walked toward the center of the hall, every eye in the room following her, whispers already breaking out like a fire catching dry grass. Seraphine's face had gone pale with something between confusion and fury. The pack elders exchanged looks that Elira could not read. She stopped a respectful distance from the king and lowered her eyes the way she had been taught, though she could feel his stare like heat against her skin. "What is your name?" Draven asked. It was not a question so much as a demand. "Elira Voss, my lord," she said, her voice barely steady. "Voss." One of the elders stepped forward quickly, his voice thin with alarm. "My king, forgive the confusion. This girl is a servant. She is wolfless, unbonded to the pack mind, unable to shift. She has no place in the choosing ritual. There has clearly been some manner of error." "There is no error." Draven's voice dropped low, and something dangerous moved beneath it, something that made the elder step back instinctively. His eyes had not left Elira's face. "I know what I sent, old man. I have never been wrong about it in my life, and I am not wrong now." The hall erupted into a storm of whispers that Elira could not follow, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. She did not understand what was happening. She only understood that the most powerful man in the Northern Territories was staring at her as though she were the only person standing in that entire glittering hall, and that whatever was happening to her in this moment, there would be no going back to invisibility once it was finished. Draven took one step closer, close enough that she could see the intensity burning behind his controlled expression, close enough that his voice, when he spoke again, was meant only for her. "Do you feel it?" he asked quietly. "Whatever this is between us, tell me you feel it too." And to her own horror, standing in a hall full of people who had spent her whole life calling her nothing, Elira Voss realized that she did. Elira did not answer him. She could not. Her throat had closed around every word she might have said, and so she simply stood there, feeling the entire hall watch her the way people watch a fire spreading, unable to look away and unwilling to step closer. Draven straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the whole room, steady and absolute, the voice of a king who had never once needed to raise his tone to be obeyed. "This is the woman the bond has chosen," he said. "Elira Voss will be presented before the pack as my mate." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks, thick and electric and dangerous. Then it shattered all at once. Voices rose from every corner of the hall, some in disbelief, some in open outrage, the pack elders murmuring urgently to one another. Seraphine Vance, standing frozen at the front of the room with an expression that had gone from confusion to something colder and far more calculating. "My king," the same elder tried again, his voice trembling now, with respect. "The law is clear. A wolfless cannot bond. It is not merely tradition. It is written into the old codes themselves. Whatever you believe you have scented, it cannot be." "Are you telling me," Draven said, turning slowly toward the elder, "that you understand the bond of a king's wolf better than the king himself does?" The elder's mouth opened and closed without producing a sound. Nobody in that hall, however outraged, was foolish enough to argue further with a king whose reputation for controlled fury was known across every territory in the north. The elder bowed low and stepped back into the crowd, and the room settled into a tense, watchful quiet, though Elira could feel the resentment radiating from every direction, like heat from a fire. She still had not moved. She still had not spoken. She stood in the center of that hall in her plain gray servant's dress, mud still faintly staining the hem from 3 nights before, and she understood with a dizzy, falling sensation that her entire life had just been rewritten in the space of a few sentences. "Come," Draven said, and this time his voice was quieter, meant only for her again. He extended his hand, not as a command, but almost, strangely, as a question. You do not have to be afraid of me. Alira looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Every instinct she had spent years building told her that stepping toward a powerful man who wanted something from her never ended well. But something in his eyes, some quiet steadiness beneath all that controlled power, made her lift her own hand and place it in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and careful, as though she were something that might break if he held on too tightly. A murmur rippled through the crowd again, softer this time, almost reverent, and Alira understood that whatever doubts remained in that hall, none of them could argue with what they had just witnessed. A king did not touch a woman gently in front of his entire court unless something real had passed between them. The following hours blurred together in Alira's memory, like a dream she could not quite hold on to. She was led from the great hall through a side corridor, away from the noise and the whispers, into a smaller chamber, where two women she did not recognize immediately began fussing over her, pulling pins from her hair, offering her water, speaking in hushed, excited tones about gowns and travel, and the capital city she would soon be seeing for the first time in her life. "Wait," Alira said, finally finding her voice again. "Wait, please. I need someone to explain what is happening. I need to see my brother." One of the women, older, with kind eyes and gray, threaded through her dark hair, paused and knelt in front of her. "You are frightened. That is understandable. My name is Marian. I have served the Ashgrave house for many years, and I promise you, child, nobody here means you harm." "I don't understand any of this," Alira admitted, her composure finally cracking around the edges. "An hour ago I was a servant nobody in that hall would even look at directly. Now I am supposed to become a queen. It doesn't make sense. It isn't possible." Marian's expression softened further. "The bond does not ask permission from any of us, my dear. Not from you, not from the king, not from the old codes the elders love to quote. It simply is. I have served 3 kings in my lifetime, and I have never once seen King Draven look at anyone the way he looked at you tonight. He barely knows me." "Knowing comes later," Marian said gently. "The bond comes first. That is how it has always worked, for as long as our kind has existed." Alira wanted to argue further, wanted to insist that this was all some enormous mistake that would correct itself by morning, but exhaustion and shock had worn her down to something raw and quiet. She allowed the women to finish preparing her, though she refused the elaborate gown they offered, asking instead for something simple, something that did not feel like a costume for a role she had never auditioned for. Callum was allowed to see her briefly before she departed with the king's procession that same evening. He found her standing near the stables, staring out at the darkening tree line beyond the settlement, and when he called her name, she turned and nearly collapsed into his arms. "They're saying you're leaving tonight," Callum said, his voice tight with worry. "That you're going to the capital. That you're going to be, Alira, are you actually going to be queen?" "I don't know what I'm going to be," she admitted. "I only know that everything I believed about my life this morning turned out to be wrong by evening." "Is he cruel to you?" "The king. Did he hurt you? Did he threaten you?" "No." Alira shook her head firmly. "No, Callum. He has been nothing but careful with me so far. But I'm terrified anyway. What if this is some trick? What if the pack elders find a way to undo this, and I end up worse off than before? What if I go to that capital, and everyone there hates me, the way everyone here has always hated me?" Callum held her by the shoulders, his young face fierce, with a determination that reminded her painfully of their father. "Then you survive it the way you've always survived everything. You don't let them see you break. You told me that yourself." Alira laughed despite herself, a small wet sound caught somewhere between tears and disbelief. "I did say that, didn't I?" "I'll write to you," Callum promised. "Every week, and someday, when I'm old enough, I'll come find you, wherever you end up. I won't let you disappear into some palace and forget where you came from." "I could never forget," Alira said, pulling him into one more tight embrace. "You're the only home I've ever really had." The king's procession departed Blackthorn under a sky full of stars, a long line of mounted guards and covered carriages winding along the forest road toward the capital city of the Ashgrave territory. Illyra rode inside one of the covered carriages, alone at first, watching the torchlit settlement grow smaller behind her until the trees swallowed it completely. She had never left Blackthorn in her entire life. She had never seen a city larger than the modest trading post 2 days' ride to the east. Now she was traveling toward the seat of power for the entire northern Lycan territories, toward a life she had no framework for understanding, sitting in a carriage finer than any room she had ever slept in. The carriage door opened partway through the first night's ride, and Draven climbed inside, settling across from her with the easy, controlled grace of a man used to commanding space wherever he went. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves against the forest road and the creak of the carriage wheels. "You have questions," Draven said finally. "More than I know how to ask," Illyra admitted. "Ask the first one that comes to mind. I will answer honestly, whatever it is." Illyra studied him in the dim lantern light, this man who held absolute power over territories larger than she could properly imagine, who had, hours ago, upended every rule she had ever been told governed her existence. "Why me?" she said. "Out of every noble daughter paraded in front of you tonight, women trained their entire lives to become your queen. Why choose the wolfless servant girl nobody else would even look at?" Something flickered across Draven's face, quick and complicated, gone before she could fully read it. "I did not choose you," he said. "That is the part the elders back in that hall refused to understand, and honestly, the part I am still trying to understand myself. My wolf chose you. The moment I stepped into that hall, before I had even seen your face, I scented something that felt like coming home after years of being lost. I have met hundreds of women in my life, Illyra, daughters of every powerful family across the north, women far more suited by birth and training to sit beside a king. None of them ever made me feel what I felt the instant I caught your scent." "That still doesn't explain why," Illyra pressed. "Wolfless women cannot bond. The elders said it themselves. It's written in the old codes." Draven's jaw tightened. The old codes were written by men who wanted to control who could hold power. "I have learned, over the years I have ruled, that many of the old codes exist to serve those men rather than any actual truth about our kind. I do not yet understand how a bond formed with someone who cannot shift. I only know that it happened, and that I have never once in my life questioned my own wolf's instincts, because they have never once been wrong." Illyra turned to look out the small carriage window at the dark trees rushing past, trying to steady the storm of feelings churning inside her. Fear, certainly. Confusion, endlessly. But underneath all of it, something she refused to name yet, something warm and dangerous that she was not ready to trust. "They will hate me at your capital," she said quietly, "the way they hated me at Blackthorn. Worse, probably, because there I was only a servant. Here I will be a queen they believe stole a place that should have belonged to someone else. Then they will have to learn to accept it," Draven said, and there was iron in his voice now, the voice of a king rather than a man. "I did not fight for this territory, did not hold it together through years of threats from rival packs, only to let anyone, noble or otherwise, dictate who stands beside me. You are under my protection now, Illyra Voss. That is not a small thing. Whatever cruelty found you in Blackthorn will not find you again." "You barely know me," she said again, echoing her own words from hours before. "How can you promise something like that?" Draven leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes steady on hers, and for the first time since she had met him, something almost gentle crossed his controlled features. "Because I intend to know you," he said simply. "Every part of you, however long that takes." Illyra did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, and the two of them rode the rest of that first night in a silence that felt, strangely, less like tension and more like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. They reached the capital city of Ashgrave 3 days later, and Illyra's first sight of it stole the breath from her lungs. Towers of pale stone rose above a sprawling city built into the side of a mountain, banners bearing the wolf sigil of the royal house snapping in the wind from every rampart. The palace itself sat at the city's highest point, vast and imposing, its architecture blending old fortress strength with the kind of quiet elegance that only centuries of wealth could produce. Crowds had gathered along the main road leading into the city, drawn by news that the king had returned with his chosen mate. Illyra sat rigid in the carriage as it passed through the gates, painfully aware of hundreds of curious eyes studying her through the window, painfully aware that she wore a simple traveling dress, while every person watching her arrive expected to see a queen dressed in silk and jewels. "Breathe," Draven murmured beside her, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "They are curious, nothing more. Curiosity fades. Give them time." "And if it doesn't fade," Illyra whispered back, "if they decide, the way Blackthorn decided, that I will always be less than I should be?" Draven's hand found hers in the shadowed interior of the carriage, and he held it firmly, steadying, as the gates of his palace rose before them. "Then they will be wrong," he said, "and I have never once in my life allowed people to remain comfortably wrong about something that matters." The carriage rolled to a stop in the palace courtyard, and Illyra Voss, once called Wolfless, once called Worthless, stepped down onto stone polished smooth by centuries of royal feet, and looked up at the enormous doors that would now, somehow, lead into her new life. Life inside the Ashgrave Palace unfolded in ways Illyra could not have imagined even a week earlier. She was given a chamber larger than her entire cottage back in Blackthorn, with tall windows overlooking the mountains, and a bed piled with blankets so soft she almost did not know how to sleep in it that first night, accustomed as she was to a thin mattress on a hard wooden frame. Marian, the same gray-haired woman who had comforted her before she left Blackthorn, had traveled with the procession and now took charge of preparing Illyra for her new role, though preparing turned out to be a gentler word than the reality of it. There were meals with unfamiliar courses served in a precise order Illyra kept forgetting. There were forms of address for nobles, ranked by seniority she could not keep straight. There was an entire language of gesture and posture that every high-born person in that palace seemed to have absorbed from birth, and that Illyra now had to learn in weeks rather than a lifetime. "You are doing better than you think," Marian told her one morning, adjusting the collar of a deep blue gown that Illyra still felt strange wearing, as though she might be caught and punished for stealing it. "Most high-born brides stumble through their first month here. You have stumbled far less than most, and you had no training at all." "I feel like a fraud every hour of every day," Illyra admitted, staring at her own reflection in a mirror taller than she was. The woman looking back at her, dressed in fine cloth, hair carefully arranged, looked like someone else entirely. Someone who belonged in a palace. She did not yet feel like that woman on the inside. "Give it time," Marian said, echoing Draven's words from the carriage. "Nobody expects you to become a queen overnight, least of all the king." That last part, at least, seemed true. Draven made a point of finding time for her most days, though his responsibilities as ruler of an entire territory kept him occupied for long hours she did not fully understand the shape of. He would appear in her chambers in the evenings, sometimes for only a few minutes, sometimes for longer, and he would ask her questions about her day, about Blackthorn, about the small details of her life before the choosing ritual had rewritten everything. "Tell me about your brother," he said one evening, seated across from her, near the fireplace, while rain traced patterns down the tall windows. "Callum," Illyra said, warmth entering her voice despite the ache of missing him. "He's 16, stubborn. He tried to fight a grown shifter with a wooden staff once, over me, and very nearly got himself hurt for it. He sounds brave." "He's reckless," Illyra corrected, though she was smiling now. "But yes, brave too. He's the only person in Blackthorn who ever treated me like I was worth something, before all of this happened." Draven was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "I will have him brought to the capital, if you wish it. He could study here, train with the palace guard if that interests him, or simply live nearby, so you need not be separated by so many days' ride." Illyra stared at him, startled by the offer. "You would do that? For a boy you've never met?" "I would do that for you," Draven said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made her chest tighten in a way she was still not used to. "Family matters, Illyra. I understand that better than most. Send for him, if it would ease your heart." She did send for him that same week, a letter carried by one of the palace couriers, and the thought of Callum eventually joining her in this strange new world made the palace feel, for the first time, slightly less like a beautiful cage. Not everyone in the capital shared Draven's patience, however. Illyra quickly learned that the noble families of the Ashgrave court had their own opinions about a wolfless queen, and few of those opinions were kind. She caught whispers in corridors that stopped the moment she appeared. She noticed the way certain ladies of the court would curtsy to her, with technically correct form and unmistakably cold eyes. She overheard, more than once, murmured conversations questioning how a woman with no wolf could possibly understand the needs of a kingdom built entirely around the strength and instincts of shifters. One afternoon, while walking through the palace gardens with Marion, Illyra encountered a cluster of noblewomen gathered near a fountain, their conversation dying into an uncomfortable silence as she approached. "Your Grace," one of them said, dipping into a shallow curtsy that felt more like a formality performed under duress than genuine respect. "We were just discussing the upcoming autumn tournament. Perhaps you are unfamiliar with the tradition, given you did not grow up among court circles." The comment was delivered politely enough that Illyra could not openly object to it, though the intended sting was unmistakable. She felt her face warm, felt the old instinct to shrink and apologize for her own existence, creeping up from years of practice at Blackthorn. But something had shifted in her since that night in the Great Hall. She was still frightened, still uncertain of nearly everything about her new life, but she was no longer willing to disappear quite so easily. "You're right that I did not grow up among court circles," Illyra said evenly, meeting the noblewoman's gaze directly instead of looking away. "I grew up scrubbing floors and hauling water before dawn. I imagine that gives me a rather different understanding of hard work than most of the people standing at this fountain have ever needed. I look forward to learning about the tournament. Perhaps you can explain it to me, since you clearly know it so well." The noblewoman's polite smile faltered, clearly unprepared for a response that did not shrink from the insult. Marion, standing slightly behind Illyra, pressed her lips together in a way that might have been hiding a smile. Of course, Your Grace," the woman managed, and the conversation that followed was stiff and brief. But Illyra walked away from that fountain, feeling something she had rarely felt in her life before. Not triumph exactly, something quieter and steadier. The sense that she did not have to be silent simply because someone expected her to be. That evening, she told Draven about the encounter, half expecting him to dismiss it as unimportant court gossip. Instead, his expression darkened, a controlled anger moving behind his eyes that reminded her, briefly, of the danger she had sensed in him the very first moment they met. "Give me her name," he said. "That behavior will not continue." "No," Illyra said quickly, surprising herself with how firmly the word came out. "Please, don't. If you punish every noblewoman who whispers about me, you'll only prove their point, that I can't survive here without a king fighting all my battles for me. I need to learn to handle this myself. I've survived worse than cold looks and cutting comments, Draven. I survived it my whole life." Draven studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "You are stronger than most of the people in this palace realize," he said. "Myself included, in those first hours in Blackthorn's hall, I saw a woman who needed protecting. I am learning I underestimated you." "Most people do," Illyra admitted. "It's easier for them to see nothing than to see someone who might surprise them." Over the following weeks, Illyra threw herself into learning everything the palace could teach her, not because she wanted to become someone else, but because she refused to remain the ignorant outsider the court whispered about behind polished smiles. She studied the histories of the northern territories late into the night, memorized the names and rivalries of every noble house, practiced the careful language of diplomacy until it no longer felt foreign in her mouth. She also began spending time in the palace kitchens and stables, places the noble ladies of the court would never think to visit, and found herself far more comfortable among the cooks and grooms and servants than among the glittering nobility upstairs. She remembered, vividly, what it felt like to be invisible labor in a grand household, and she made a point of learning the names of every servant she encountered, of thanking them, of treating them the way she had always wished someone with power might have treated her back in Blackthorn. Word of this spread quietly through the palace staff, and Illyra began to notice something she had not expected. The servants, the guards, the ordinary people who kept the palace running, began to look at her differently. Not with the wary distance the nobility offered, but with something closer to warmth, even loyalty. They had noticed a queen who saw them as people rather than furniture, and in a palace built on centuries of rigid hierarchy, that small kindness meant more than Lyra could have guessed. "You're building something," Marian observed one evening, watching Lyra return from the kitchens with flour still dusting her sleeve, where she had helped knead bread alongside the cooks. "Something the noble houses upstairs don't understand yet." "What's that?" Lyra asked. "Loyalty that isn't bought," Marian said. "The nobility believe power comes from birth and bloodline. You're proving there's another kind of power they've forgotten how to recognize." Lyra thought about those words often in the weeks that followed, especially as her relationship with Draven continued to deepen in small, careful ways. He was not an easy man to know, guarded by years of ruling a territory that demanded constant vigilance against threats both internal and external, but Lyra began to see glimpses beneath that controlled exterior. The way his shoulders relaxed, almost imperceptibly, when she entered a room, the dry, unexpected humor that surfaced when he thought no one important enough to matter was listening. The careful attention he paid to her comfort, always asking, rather than assuming what she needed. She still did not fully understand the bond that had brought them together, still could not explain how a wolfless woman had triggered a connection meant only for shifters, but she was beginning to trust that whatever it was real. Not because the elders had blessed it, not because the old codes accepted it, but because of the quiet, accumulating evidence of a man who kept his promises and treated her, increasingly, like an equal rather than an obligation. She was not yet queen in any formal sense, the coronation still weeks away as the court insisted on proper ceremony and preparation, but she was beginning, slowly, to believe that she might actually become one worth respecting. She did not yet know how many people in that palace were determined to make sure she never got the chance. The letter arrived on a gray morning, slipped beneath Lyra's chamber door sometime before dawn, and it changed the careful peace she had begun building in the palace. It was unsigned, the handwriting deliberately disguised in sharp, angular strokes, and it contained only a few lines. "You do not belong here. A wolfless girl cannot hold a true bond. Ask yourself how you truly caught the king's attention, and whether dark means were involved. The pack will not accept a queen built on stolen magic." Lyra read it 3 times before she understood the accusation fully, and each reading made her stomach twist tighter. Dark magic. As though her very existence, her very presence beside Draven, required some sinister explanation, because the truth, an actual fated bond forming with a wolfless woman, was apparently too impossible for her enemies to accept without inventing a darker story. She did not show the letter to Draven immediately. She told herself she wanted to understand its source first, though if she was honest with herself, some old, deeply worn part of her still expected that showing weakness, admitting she had been threatened, would only confirm what her enemies already believed about her. Instead, she carried the letter folded inside her sleeve for 2 days, turning the accusation over in her mind, while she continued her lessons, continued her visits to the kitchens and stables, continued trying to build the quiet foundation of trust she had started among the palace staff. It was one of the kitchen workers, a sharp-eyed young woman named Daphne, who had befriended Lyra over shared afternoons kneading bread, who first mentioned the rumor spreading through the lower halls of the palace. "They're saying strange things about you, Your Grace," Daphne admitted quietly one afternoon, glancing around to make sure no one else could overhear, "that the bond with the king isn't natural, that someone helped it along with old magic that shouldn't be touched. I don't believe it myself, for what it's worth. I've seen how the king looks at you. That's not something magic can fake." "Where is it coming from?" Lyra asked, keeping her voice steady despite the cold feeling spreading through her chest. "The rumor. Do you know who started it?" Daphne hesitated, clearly weighing loyalty against caution. "I can't say for certain. But there's been more coin than usual moving through certain hands lately. Servants paid to whisper things in the right ears. I only know because my cousin works in Lady Seraphine's household, and she's seen the coin herself." Seraphine Vance. The name settled into Lyra's chest like a stone dropping into still water. She had almost forgotten, in the whirlwind of adjusting to palace life, that Seraphine had traveled to the capital shortly after Lyra's own arrival, her family securing a position among the court nobility, close enough to remain a constant, watchful presence at every gathering Lyra attended. That evening, Alira finally showed Draven the letter, her hands steady even as her voice was not. Draven read it twice, his expression darkening with a controlled fury that reminded her, again, of the dangerous power coiled beneath his careful exterior. Who delivered this to your chamber? I don't know. It was under my door before dawn. And you have carried this for 2 days without telling me? I didn't want you charging into a fight before I understood what I was actually facing, Alira said. I told you before, Draven. I need to be able to handle some of this myself. This is not court gossip about a tournament, Draven said, his voice low and hard. This is an accusation of dark magic against the future queen of this territory. If that accusation spreads and takes root among the wrong people, it could be used to challenge the legitimacy of our bond entirely. This is not a battle you fight alone, Alira. This threatens both of us. Alira knew he was right, even as some stubborn part of her resisted the reminder that she was no longer entirely alone in facing the world's cruelty. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, having someone whose power matched or exceeded the threats arrayed against her, and she was still learning how to accept help without feeling as though she had failed some private test of endurance. I suspect Seraphine Vance, Alira admitted. One of the kitchen staff mentioned coin moving through her household, paying servants to spread rumors. Draven's jaw tightened. Seraphine has wanted this position since before I ever set foot in Blackthorn's hall. Her family has spent years positioning her as the obvious choice for any king seeking a mate. Losing that opportunity to a servant girl would have wounded her pride in ways her family would consider unforgivable. What do we do? For now, nothing that shows our hand, Draven said, some of the controlled calculation of a ruler settling back over his features. If we accuse her without proof, her family will claim persecution, and sympathy among the nobility could shift toward her. We watch. We gather evidence. And in the meantime, you continue exactly what you have been doing, Alira, building your own alliances among the people who actually see your worth, rather than the ones determined to see only your weaknesses. The advice proved wiser than Alira initially appreciated. Over the following weeks, she noticed the whispers about dark magic beginning to circulate more openly, though never quite loudly enough to be confronted directly. She noticed certain noble families growing colder toward her, certain invitations to smaller gatherings mysteriously failing to reach her, small social exclusions designed to isolate her from any support among the court's upper circles. But she also noticed the opposite happening in quieter corners of the palace. The servants she had befriended defended her fiercely whenever the rumors reached their ears, several of them tracing the coin trail Daphne had first mentioned, gathering small pieces of evidence that slowly, patiently, began to form a clearer picture. Marian proved an unexpected ally in this effort as well, her decades of service in the Ashgrave household giving her access to information and relationships that Alira, still new to the palace, could not have navigated alone. Lady Seraphine has been meeting privately with several members of the old council, Marian reported one evening, her voice carefully lowered, even though they were alone in Alira's chamber. Men who never fully accepted King Draven's authority after his own difficult ascension to the throne years ago. Men who might see an opportunity in weakening the king's position through his choice of queen. His ascension was difficult? Alira had heard only vague references to this before, always brushed aside quickly whenever she asked. Marian's expression grew troubled. That is not my story to tell, child. Ask the king himself, when the time feels right. I will only say this. There are old wounds in this palace that have never fully healed, and I fear Lady Seraphine may be attempting to reopen them for her own purposes. Alira turned this information over carefully in the days that followed, sensing that whatever secret lay beneath Draven's guarded moments, whatever old wound Marian had referenced, connected somehow to the growing threat gathering around her. She noticed, now that she was watching more closely, small signs she had previously overlooked. The way Draven sometimes favored his left side during longer training sessions with his guard, a stiffness he worked hard to conceal. The way certain topics, mentioned only in passing by careless courtiers, would cause his expression to shutter closed instantly, a door slamming on some old pain he refused to discuss. She did not push him for answers before he was ready to give them. She had learned, from her own painful history, that trust could not be forced, only earned through patience and consistency. Instead, she focused on strengthening her own position, continuing her studies, continuing her quiet work among the palace staff, continuing to prove, day by day, that whatever accusations Seraphine Vance whispered in dark corners, the truth of Alira's character spoke louder to anyone willing to actually look. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived at a formal court gathering held to celebrate the upcoming harvest season, an event attended by every significant noble family in the territory. Alira wore a deep green gown that evening, her hair arranged in the careful style Marian had taught her, and she moved through the crowded ballroom with a composure that had grown steadily over her weeks in the palace, though her heart still raced whenever too many cold, assessing eyes turned toward her at once. Seraphine approached her near the center of the room, flanked by two of her closest companions, her smile polished and dangerous in equal measure. "Your Grace," Seraphine said, her voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to overhear. "How wonderful to see you adjusting so well to court life. Though I confess, I have heard the strangest rumors lately. Something about unusual circumstances surrounding your bond with the king. Surely you can put such gossip to rest yourself, since you would know better than anyone whether there was anything unnatural involved." The words landed exactly as intended, a public accusation disguised as polite concern, forcing Alira to either address the rumor directly, giving it more weight by acknowledging it, or ignore it, and risk the accusation spreading unchecked. Several nearby conversations had already quieted, listeners drawn in by the tension crackling beneath Seraphine's pleasant tone. Alira felt the old instinct rise, the urge to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller in the face of a more powerful woman's cruelty. She pushed it down, drawing instead on every lesson she had absorbed over the past weeks, every quiet moment of courage she had practiced since that first confrontation at the fountain. "How curious," Alira said, her voice calm and clear enough to carry just as far as Seraphine's had. "I have heard rumors too, Lady Seraphine. Something about coin moving through certain households to pay servants for spreading exactly this kind of gossip. I wonder if you've heard anything about that." Seraphine's polished smile faltered, just for a moment, but long enough for several nearby nobles to notice. "I have no idea what you're referring to." "No," Alira agreed pleasantly. "I imagine you wouldn't. Rumors have a way of appearing from nowhere, don't they? Especially when someone benefits greatly from them spreading." She let the silence stretch a moment longer before continuing, her voice softening slightly, though no less firm. "I understand you expected a different outcome from the choosing ritual, Lady Seraphine. That disappointment is understandable. But I will not stand quietly while you attempt to poison the court against something you cannot change, through whispers and paid gossip. My bond with the king is not your business to question, and it will not be undone by rumors, however carefully funded." The ballroom had gone genuinely quiet now, dozens of eyes moving between the two women, and Alira held Seraphine's furious gaze without flinching, standing straighter than she had ever managed to stand in Blackthorn's great hall. Seraphine recovered quickly, forcing her smile back into place, though something colder and more calculating had replaced the earlier pleasant mask. "How bold you've become, Your Grace. I suppose the king's favor has given you quite the confidence." "No," Alira said quietly. "This confidence is mine. I earned it long before I ever met the king, surviving things you have never had to survive, Lady Seraphine. I suggest you remember that, before you decide I am someone easily frightened." She turned and walked away before Seraphine could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs, though her steps remained steady until she reached the relative privacy of the garden terrace outside the ballroom. There, finally alone, she allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding, her hands trembling now that the confrontation had passed. "That was well done," a voice said from the shadows near the terrace railing, and Alira startled to find Draven standing there, having apparently witnessed at least part of the exchange from a distance. "I nearly lost my composure entirely," Alira admitted. "You did not lose it at all," Draven said, stepping closer, something like pride evident in his expression, despite the careful control he maintained in public. "You handled that with more grace than most trained diplomats in my court. Seraphine will not soon forget tonight. She will not stop either," Alira said, the momentary satisfaction of the confrontation fading into a more sober awareness. Tonight only made her angrier. I fear this is only the beginning of whatever she's planning. Draven's expression grew serious, the warmth in his eyes hardening into something more watchful. Then we prepare for whatever comes next together, he said. Whatever Seraphine is planning, whatever old wounds she is attempting to reopen, you will not face it alone. I promise you that. Illyra wanted to believe the promise fully, wanted to trust that whatever storm was gathering around them could be weathered together, but as she looked out over the darkened gardens, she could not shake the growing sense that the confrontation in the ballroom was only the first visible sign of a much deeper danger, already moving quietly beneath the surface of the court, one that threatened far more than her reputation alone. The training yard behind the palace's western wing was usually empty at dawn, which was exactly why Illyra had taken to walking there in the quiet hours before her lessons began, enjoying the rare solitude before the palace filled with the noise and demands of the day. It was there, on a cool morning, several days after the confrontation with Seraphine, that she witnessed something she was never meant to see. Draven stood alone in the center of the training yard, stripped down to a simple training tunic, attempting to shift. Illyra had never actually watched a shifter transform before, had only heard descriptions from Callum and others back in Blackthorn, quick, seamless changes between human and wolf form that shifters performed as naturally as breathing. What she witnessed instead was Draven's entire body tensing, his jaw clenched tight, sweat breaking out across his forehead as he strained against something invisible and resistant. His shift, when it finally began, was slow and visibly painful, his human form flickering at the edges without fully completing the transformation, his breath coming in ragged gasps until, with a sound of frustration that echoed across the empty yard, he stopped entirely, remaining in human form, his shoulders heaving. Illyra stood frozen at the edge of the yard, uncertain whether to retreat before he noticed her, or step forward and acknowledge what she had witnessed. Before she could decide, Draven's head turned sharply toward her, his sharp senses having caught her presence despite her stillness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Illyra could see something raw and unguarded in his expression, an exposure he clearly had not intended anyone to witness, least of all her. "How long have you been standing there?" he asked, his voice rough. "Long enough," Illyra admitted, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. She walked slowly into the yard, closing the distance between them. "Draven, what was that?" He looked away from her, out toward the mountains beyond the palace walls, his jaw tight with something that looked almost like shame, an expression so foreign on a man, usually so composed, that it startled her more than the difficult shift itself had. "Something I do not discuss," he said finally, "with anyone." "I'm not anyone," Illyra said quietly. "Please, Draven, I've spent my entire life being the person everyone assumed was broken, incomplete, less than whole. If something similar is happening to you, I think I might understand better than most people in this palace ever could." Something in her words seemed to reach him, some crack forming in the careful wall he had maintained since she had known him. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "6 years ago," he began, "before I held this throne securely, there was an attempt on my life, a poison, administered slowly over months by someone within my own household, someone I trusted. By the time we discovered what was happening, the damage had already been done. The poison did not kill me, but it damaged something deep within my wolf, some connection between my human mind and my shifted form that has never fully healed since." Illyra's chest tightened, imagining the betrayal, the slow horror of realizing someone close enough to poison him had wanted him dead. "Who did this to you?" "A member of the court council, working alongside a family with ambitions of their own," Draven said. "The council member was executed for his crime once we uncovered the plot. The family behind him, however, was never definitively proven guilty, though I have always suspected their involvement ran deeper than we could ever confirm." "What family?" Illyra asked, though some cold, dawning certainty had already begun forming in her mind before he answered. "The Vance family," Draven said quietly. "Seraphine's family." Illyra felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath her feet, pieces of a larger, darker picture beginning to arrange themselves in her mind. "Draven, if her family was involved in poisoning you 6 years ago, and now Seraphine is spreading rumors and gathering support among disaffected council members who never fully accepted your authority. I know, Draven said grimly. I have suspected for some time that Seraphine's presence at court, her sudden interest in positioning herself close to power again, might connect to old grievances her family never abandoned. But suspicion is not proof, Illyra. Without evidence, accusing a powerful noble family of treason and attempted regicide would tear this court apart, potentially without even achieving justice, if they have covered their tracks as carefully as they did 6 years ago. So what do we do? Illyra asked, though the question felt strange coming from her, a wolfless girl who 6 weeks ago had been scrubbing floors, now discussing treason and conspiracy with the king she was meant to marry. We watch, we gather proof, and we do not let them know we suspect anything until we have enough evidence to act decisively. Draven's eyes met hers, something vulnerable still lingering beneath the returning steadiness of his composure. I have not told anyone the full truth of what happened 6 years ago, Illyra. Not even most of my closest advisors know the extent of the damage the poison caused. I do not know why I am telling you now, except that something about you makes it easier to speak difficult truths. Maybe that's part of the bond, Illyra offered softly. Whatever connects us, whatever the elders back in Blackthorn couldn't explain or accept. Maybe it isn't only about scent or fate. Maybe it's about finally finding someone safe enough to be honest with. Draven studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, softening into an openness she had not seen from him before. You have never once looked at me the way the court does, he said. Not with fear of my power, not with calculation about what you might gain from my favor. You looked at a man struggling in a training yard and saw only someone in pain. I know what it feels like to be seen as broken, Illyra said. I would never do that to someone else, not even a king. Something passed between them in that quiet training yard, something that felt more significant than the formal bond that had brought them together in Blackthorn's great hall. Draven reached for her hand, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, it did not feel like a king comforting a frightened servant girl. It felt like two people who had both spent years being underestimated, finally recognizing something true in each other. I need you to understand something, Draven said quietly. My inability to fully shift is not merely embarrassing weakness, though the court would certainly frame it that way if they discovered it. It is dangerous. A king who cannot fully access his wolf's strength is vulnerable in ways our enemies, both inside and outside this territory, would exploit ruthlessly if they knew. This secret has protected me for 6 years. If Seraphine or her family have somehow learned the truth, and are using that knowledge to plan something against us, the danger extends far beyond wounded pride or contested rumors. Then we need to move faster, Illyra said, her mind already working through the problem with a clarity that surprised her. If Seraphine knows about your condition, she might be planning to use it, to expose it publicly at the worst possible moment, or worse, to attempt something similar to what her family tried 6 years ago. I have increased the guard around my personal chambers and meals, Draven said. But you are right that we cannot simply wait and watch indefinitely. Whatever Seraphine is planning, I suspect it will come to a head soon. Ambitious families rarely have the patience for long, slow campaigns once they believe an opportunity is within reach. Over the following days, Illyra found herself drawn more deeply into the quiet, careful work of investigation alongside Draven and his most trusted advisors, a small circle that now included Marion and, cautiously, Daphne from the kitchens, whose network of servant connections continued proving invaluable. Illyra learned to read the subtle signs of court politics, the alliances forming and dissolving beneath polished smiles, the careful positioning of families who sensed instability gathering and wanted to ensure they landed on the winning side, whatever that side turned out to be. She also grew closer to Draven during this period in ways that had little to do with the growing danger surrounding them. Shared secrets, she was learning, had a way of binding people together more tightly than shared triumphs. Draven began seeking her counsel, not merely as his intended queen, but as someone whose instincts and observations he had come to genuinely trust, and Illyra found herself, for the first time in her life, valued for her mind, rather than dismissed for her missing wolf. You see things others miss, Draven told her one evening, reviewing notes about Seraphine's recent movements together in his private study. My advisors have spent years in this court, trained in politics and strategy since childhood, and yet you noticed the pattern in Seraphine's servant payments before any of them did. I spent my whole life watching people who had power over me, trying to predict their cruelty before it happened, Illyra said. It turns out that skill is useful for more than just survival. It is useful for exactly the kind of survival we may soon need, Draven said grimly, setting down the notes and meeting her eyes across the study. I believe Seraphine is preparing something significant, Illyra, something beyond rumors and social exclusion. I do not yet know what, but I intend to be ready when it comes. Illyra reached across the space between them and took his hand, feeling the same steady warmth she had come to associate with him over the past weeks. Whatever it is, she said, we'll face it together. You promised me that once. In the garden. I'm holding you to it. I intend to keep that promise, Draven said, for as long as I draw breath. Neither of them yet knew how soon that promise would be tested. The proof, when it finally surfaced, came from an unlikely source. A young guardsman named Finn, who had served under Seraphine's household before transferring to the palace guard several months earlier, approached Marion quietly one evening, his expression troubled in a way that immediately caught her attention. He had, he explained, overheard a conversation he could not stop thinking about, one that had gnawed at his conscience for days before he finally decided he needed to tell someone. I was delivering messages between households, Finn explained, sitting nervously in Illyra's private sitting room, while Draven, Marion, and Illyra listened intently. Lady Seraphine was meeting with 2 council members late at night, men I recognized from court but did not know personally. I only overheard fragments through the door, but they mentioned something about finishing what was started 6 years ago, about the king's weakness being the key to correcting what they called an unnatural bond. Illyra felt her stomach turn cold. They know, she said quietly, glancing at Draven. About the shift, about the poison from years ago. They know everything. There's more, Finn continued, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. They mentioned a gathering planned for the upcoming tournament, something about using the crowds and the chaos of the event to their advantage. I did not understand all of what they discussed, but I understood enough to know that whatever they are planning, it is meant to happen soon, and it is meant to hurt the king. Draven's expression had gone very still, the controlled calm of a man processing dangerous information and calculating his next move with careful precision. The autumn tournament is in 5 days, he said. If they are planning something during the event itself, we have very little time to prepare a proper response. Why haven't you said anything before now? Marion asked Finn gently, though the question carried an edge of concern. I was afraid, Finn admitted, his young face flushing with shame. Lady Seraphine's family is powerful. I worried what might happen to me, or to my family, if word got back that I had informed on them. But then I thought about the Queen. He glanced at Illyra, something like genuine respect in his expression. She spoke to me once, weeks ago, when I was new to the palace guard, and everyone else treated me like I didn't matter yet. She asked my name. She remembered it the next time she saw me. That's more than most nobles in this court have ever bothered to do for someone like me. I couldn't stay silent while something happened to her, or to the king, when I might have been able to stop it. Illyra felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The small kindnesses she had extended without calculation, without expecting anything in return, had somehow found their way back to her in this critical moment, proof that Marion's earlier observation held true. Loyalty that isn't bought proved stronger, in the end, than loyalty commanded through fear or obligation. You have done something very brave, coming forward, Draven told Finn seriously. You will be protected, and your courage will not be forgotten, but I need you to think carefully. Did you hear anything else, any specific details about how they intend to use the tournament, or what exactly they mean by finishing what was started 6 years ago? Finn concentrated, clearly trying to recall every fragment of the overheard conversation. They mentioned something about the tournament's final ceremony, when the king traditionally fights an exhibition match before the assembled crowd. I believe they intend to somehow interfere with that match, though I do not know the specifics. And they mentioned needing the Wolfless woman removed from the picture before the ceremony, so that any accident that befell the king could not be laid at their feet, with the queen alive to demand a full investigation. The room went very quiet at that. Illyra felt Draven's hand find hers instinctively, gripping tightly. "They intend to eliminate you," Draven said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Illyra had not heard since that very first night in Blackthorn's hall, when he had faced down the pack elders questioning his authority. "Before they move against me." "We don't know the specifics yet," Illyra said, forcing herself to remain calm despite the fear curling through her chest. "We have 5 days. That's enough time to prepare, to gather more information, to prevent whatever they're planning before it happens. Or it's enough time for them to accelerate their plans, now that they may suspect their conversation was overheard," Draven countered grimly. "Finn, does anyone in Seraphine's household know you transferred information to us?" "No, my lord. I told no one else. I came directly to Marion, as quietly as I could manage." "Good. Keep it that way. For now, we proceed carefully. I will increase security around the Queen immediately, though quietly enough not to alert Seraphine that we suspect anything. Marion, I need you to continue gathering whatever information you can through the servant networks." "And Illyra," Draven turned to her, his expression torn between the protective instinct clearly warring within him and the respect he had developed for her judgment over the past weeks. "I want to confine you to the palace's inner chambers until the tournament passes, with guards posted at every entrance." "No," Illyra said immediately, the word coming out firmer than she expected. "Draven, if I disappear from public view for 5 days, Seraphine will know something has changed. She'll know we suspect her, and she'll either accelerate her plans in ways we can't predict, or she'll simply wait us out and try again later when we're less prepared. I need to continue behaving exactly as I have been, attending court functions, walking in the gardens, all of it. If I hide, we lose whatever advantage surprise gives us." "I will not risk your life for strategic advantage," Draven said, his voice tightening with barely restrained emotion. "You won't be risking it," Illyra said, softening her tone but not backing down. "We'll take precautions, additional guards, but subtle ones. I won't go anywhere alone. But Draven, I refuse to spend the next 5 days locked in a room while you face this threat without me. We agreed to face this together. That promise doesn't stop mattering, just because the danger has become real instead of theoretical." Draven studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her at any cost and his growing respect for her judgment and courage. Finally, something in his expression softened into reluctant acceptance. "Additional guards," he said, "discreet ones, positioned to watch without being obvious. You do not go anywhere without at least one of them nearby, day or night. And the moment anything feels wrong, anything at all, you come to me immediately. Agreed?" "Agreed," Illyra said, relief loosening some of the tension in her chest. The following days passed in a strange, tense rhythm of maintained normalcy, layered over frantic, quiet preparation. Illyra continued her usual routines, walking in the gardens, visiting the kitchens, attending smaller court gatherings, all while additional guards trailed discreetly at a distance, and Draven's most trusted advisors worked to identify every council member who had aligned themselves with Seraphine's growing faction. The picture that emerged over those days was more troubling than any of them had initially anticipated. Seraphine's family had spent years quietly cultivating relationships with council members who resented Draven's authority, some still nursing old grievances from disputes predating even the poisoning attempt 6 years earlier, others simply drawn by ambition and the promise of increased influence under a different arrangement of power. What had begun as one family's wounded pride over a lost marriage opportunity had, over years, grown into something far more organized and dangerous. "This isn't only about you anymore," Draven told Illyra grimly, 3 days before the tournament, as they reviewed the growing list of suspected conspirators together in his private study. "This is about control of the entire territory. Seraphine's family sees an opportunity to weaken my authority significantly, perhaps even replace me entirely if their plans at the tournament succeed. You becoming my queen was simply the catalyst that finally gave them a plausible excuse to act." "Then we can't simply prevent whatever they're planning at the tournament," Illyra said, understanding the deeper stakes now, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her. "We need to expose the entire conspiracy. Otherwise, they'll simply try again, in some other form, at some other moment. Agreed, Draven said, which means we need more than Finn's overheard conversation. We need concrete evidence that will hold up before the full council, evidence that cannot be dismissed as rumor or coincidence. Marion, who had been quietly working through the evening alongside them, finally spoke up from where she sat, reviewing a stack of household ledgers she had managed to acquire through her extensive network of contacts. I believe I may have found something, she said, sliding one of the ledgers across the table toward Draven. Payments from Seraphine's household, disguised as purchases of rare herbs and medicinal supplies, moving to an apothecary known for supplying substances that are difficult to obtain through legitimate means, the same apothecary, if the older records are accurate, that supplied the poison used against you 6 years ago. The room fell silent as Draven studied the ledger, his jaw tightening with each line he read. This is not conclusive proof of intent, he said finally, but combined with Finn's testimony, and whatever else we can gather in the next 3 days, it may be enough to bring formal charges before the full council, rather than allowing Seraphine's plans to unfold unchallenged at the tournament. Then we have 3 days to finish building an undeniable case, Elira said, feeling the weight of what was coming settle over her, before everything comes to a head in front of the entire court. Draven reached for her hand across the table, his grip firm and steady despite the danger gathering around them both. 3 days, he agreed, and then, one way or another, this ends. Neither of them could have predicted, in that quiet study with its careful stacks of evidence, just how violently those 3 days would ultimately unfold. The 3 days leading up to the tournament passed with an unbearable tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the palace, though only a small circle of trusted allies understood the true weight of what was building beneath the surface. Elira continued her careful performance of normalcy, smiling through court gatherings, walking the gardens with practiced ease, all while her mind worked constantly through contingencies and fears she could share with no one outside her small, trusted circle. Draven had decided, after much deliberation with his advisors, that the safest course of action was to present their evidence to the full council on the morning of the tournament itself, before the public ceremonies began, rather than waiting until the exhibition match Seraphine's faction apparently intended to exploit. Confronting the conspiracy publicly, in front of witnesses and with clear evidence, offered the best chance of exposing the full scope of the plot while minimizing the danger of violence erupting during the crowded public event. If we accuse them privately first, they may find ways to hide evidence or flee before the council can act, Draven explained during their final strategy session the night before the tournament. Public exposure, in front of the assembled council and enough witnesses to prevent any attempt at cover-up, gives us the best chance of ending this decisively. And if they realize what's happening and attempt something violent instead of simply accepting exposure, Elira asked, unable to fully quiet the fear coiling in her chest. Then we will be prepared for that as well, Draven said grimly. I have doubled the guard presence for tomorrow's ceremonies, positioned discreetly enough not to alert Seraphine's faction that anything is amiss until the moment we choose to act. Elira barely slept that night, her mind cycling through every possible outcome of the following day, and when dawn finally broke over the mountains surrounding the capital, she dressed carefully in a gown of deep crimson, a color Marion had suggested would project strength and authority to anyone watching, and made her way toward the great council chamber, where the confrontation was set to unfold before the tournament's public ceremonies began. The council chamber filled quickly that morning, members of the noble houses and the ruling council, gathering for what they believed was simply an opening formality before the tournament's festivities. Seraphine Vance entered with her usual composed elegance, seated near the front alongside her family, her expression giving away nothing of whatever plans she had spent months carefully constructing. Draven rose to address the assembled council, once everyone had settled, his presence commanding immediate silence throughout the chamber. Elira stood beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs, though she forced herself to project the same calm strength she had been practicing for weeks. I have called this gathering, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly across the chamber, to address a matter of grave concern to the security and stability of this territory. Evidence has come to my attention of a conspiracy, planned over months, potentially years, to undermine my authority and threaten the safety of myself and my intended queen. A murmur rippled through the assembled council, confusion and alarm evident on many faces, though Alira watched Seraphine closely and saw something flicker across the woman's carefully composed expression, a flash of calculation quickly hidden behind practiced serenity. "I have here," Draven continued, gesturing to Marion, who stepped forward with the collected evidence, "testimony and financial records connecting certain members of this council and the Vance family to a plot involving the reintroduction of a substance previously used in an attempt against my life 6 years ago, along with plans to exploit today's tournament ceremonies to further this conspiracy." The chamber erupted into chaos, voices rising in shock and disbelief, several council members exchanging alarmed glances that suggested they had not known the full scope of what they had aligned themselves with. Seraphine rose from her seat, her composure finally cracking into something sharper and more dangerous. "This is an outrageous accusation," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Baseless slander against my family. Invented, I suspect, to distract from the deeply troubling circumstances surrounding your unnatural bond with a Wolfless servant girl who has clearly manipulated her way into a position she has no right to hold." "The evidence speaks for itself," Draven said coldly, nodding to Marion, who began distributing copies of the ledgers and testimony among the assembled council members for their own review. "Financial records connecting your household to the same apothecary that supplied the poison used against me 6 years ago. Testimony from a witness who overheard your own private discussions planning to exploit today's tournament. I would invite you to explain these coincidences, Lady Seraphine, if indeed they are merely coincidences." Seraphine's eyes swept the chamber, clearly calculating how much support remained among her allies now that exposure had arrived so publicly and so thoroughly documented. Whatever she saw in the faces around her, whatever silent calculation passed through her mind, seemed to convince her that careful denial was no longer a viable strategy. "You understand nothing," she spat, her composed mask finally shattering completely, revealing the raw fury beneath. "6 years ago, my father tried to correct a grave mistake, to remove a king too weak to properly lead this territory, wounded and vulnerable, in ways he has hidden from this very council for years. We failed then, but we have not stopped working toward what this territory actually needs. A strong king, unweakened by hidden injuries, matched with a queen of proper bloodline and training, not some wolfless nothing who stumbled into a bond through means none of us can properly understand or trust." The accusation about Draven's weakened shift landed like a physical blow across the chamber, gasps and murmurs spreading rapidly as council members absorbed the revelation that their king had concealed such a significant vulnerability for years. Alira felt Draven tense beside her, the exposure of his carefully guarded secret clearly costing him something even in this moment of confronting his enemies. "My ability to lead this territory," Draven said, his voice hard despite the vulnerability just exposed, "has never depended on the speed or ease of my shift, Lady Seraphine. It depends on judgment, on strategy, on the loyalty I have earned through fair governance rather than inherited privilege, something your family, it seems, has never fully understood." "Guards," Seraphine called out suddenly, and Alira's blood ran cold as several figures near the chamber's edges, men she now recognized as aligned with the conspiracy, moved swiftly, drawing weapons and advancing toward the front of the chamber, where Draven and Alira stood. Chaos erupted immediately, council members scrambling away from the sudden violence, Draven's own guards moving to intercept the attackers, even as more chaos spread through the crowded chamber. Alira felt herself grabbed roughly from behind, a blade pressed against her throat in a horrifying echo of that night behind the grain house in Blackthorn, though this time the danger was infinitely more real. "Move and she dies," a voice snarled near her ear, one of Seraphine's conspirators, his grip iron-tight around her arm. Draven's expression transformed instantly, the controlled fury of a moment before shifting into something far more dangerous and desperate, his eyes fixed on Alira with an intensity that cut through all the chaos surrounding them. "Let her go," Draven said, his voice deadly quiet despite the chamber's continuing chaos. "Whatever you believe you can gain from this, harming her will only ensure your complete destruction, and mine along with it, if that is truly what you seek." "We seek a proper transfer of power," Seraphine said, Though her voice carried a note of desperation now, the plan clearly unraveling faster than she had anticipated. You will step down, publicly, in favor of a council-appointed regent, or your precious Wolfless queen dies here in this chamber, in front of everyone. Alyra felt the blade press harder against her throat, felt the conspirator's arm locked tight around her, and in that terrifying moment, memories flooded back of every time in her life she had been made to feel powerless. Every moment she had been told she was worthless, wolfless, nothing. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, something she had been building slowly over the past weeks, without fully realizing it. Not a wolf's strength, but something else entirely. A strength born from surviving every previous attempt to break her. She thought suddenly of the strange warmth that had flickered through her chest in rare, unexplained moments since arriving at the palace. Moments she had dismissed as simply emotional responses to her overwhelming new life. But now, with a blade at her throat and chaos exploding around her, that warmth surged forward with startling intensity, something ancient and unfamiliar awakening deep within her in response to the mortal danger threatening to end everything before it had truly begun. The warmth spreading through Alyra's chest was unlike anything she had ever experienced, nothing like the small flickers of feeling she had grown accustomed to since arriving at the palace. This felt vast and ancient, a power that seemed to reach back through generations, connecting her to something far older than the wolf bonds that ruled every shifter she had ever known. The conspirator holding her felt it too, his grip suddenly faltering, as though the air around Alyra had grown too heavy, too charged with something he could not name or understand. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice edged with sudden uncertainty. Alyra did not fully understand it herself, but instinct guided her in that critical moment, some ancient knowledge surfacing from wherever it had lain dormant her entire life. She reached inward, toward the warmth building steadily in her chest, and released it outward, in a burst that sent the conspirator stumbling backward, his blade clattering to the stone floor, his face contorted in confused pain, as though he had touched something that burned, despite leaving no visible mark. The chamber fell into stunned silence, the chaos of moments before freezing, as every eye turned toward Alyra, standing free now in the center of the room, her hands trembling with the aftershock of whatever power had just moved through her. "Impossible," someone whispered from the crowd, though Alyra could not identify who had spoken. Draven was at her side instantly, his arm wrapping protectively around her, even as his eyes remained fixed on the retreating conspirator, wary of further attack. "Alyra," he breathed, his voice raw with a mixture of relief and astonishment. "What did you just do?" "I don't know," Alyra admitted, still trembling from the intensity of whatever had surged through her. "I felt something, when the blade was at my throat. Something old, something I've never felt before. I just reached for it." Marion, who had remained near the chamber's edge throughout the chaos, pushed forward now, with an expression of dawning understanding, old knowledge visibly connecting behind her eyes. "The Voss bloodline," she said slowly, almost to herself. "I had heard old stories, tales from before the current codes were written, of a bloodline that bonded not through the shift, but through something the ancient texts called spirit fire, a power thought extinct for generations, dismissed as legend by anyone who had never witnessed it firsthand." "Spirit fire," Draven repeated, staring at Alyra with an expression that mixed wonder with fierce protectiveness. "You are saying Alyra possesses this ancient power?" "I am saying," Marion replied, "that what we just witnessed suggests exactly that. The old codes declared wolfless women incapable of bonding because they measured worth and power only through the shift. They never accounted for a bloodline whose strength manifested differently, a strength that fate itself apparently recognized, even when the rest of us could not." Around them, the chaos of the chamber had not fully settled. Seraphine's remaining conspirators still scattered among fleeing council members, Draven's guards working to contain the situation, even as shock rippled through everyone who had witnessed Alyra's display of power. Seraphine herself stood frozen near the front of the chamber, her earlier fury replaced by something that looked almost like fear, as she stared at Alyra with newfound wariness. "This changes nothing," Seraphine said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Whatever strange power she possesses, it does not erase what I have exposed today. The king is weakened, his shift is compromised. This council deserves to know the truth about the man they have followed all these years. The council already knows the truth, Draven said, his voice hardening again, despite the momentary distraction of Alira's revelation. I have just told them myself, in this very chamber. I did not deny my condition, Lady Seraphine. I acknowledged it, and I will continue leading this territory regardless, because my worth as a ruler has never depended on the ease of my shift. Your family's attempt to use that vulnerability as a weapon, however, along with the poisoning attempt 6 years ago, and today's attack against my queen, constitutes treason of the highest order, undeniable now before dozens of witnesses. The council members who had scattered during the chaos began cautiously returning to their seats, the initial shock giving way to a grim understanding of the gravity surrounding what had just unfolded before them. Several guards had managed to detain the conspirators who had attempted the attack, including the man who had held the blade against Alira's throat, now nursing a strange, unexplained burn across his palm that would not fade. Take Lady Seraphine and the remaining conspirators into custody, Draven commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority across the now largely subdued chamber. They will face full judgment before this council, according to the laws of this territory, for treason against the crown and attempted murder of the queen. Seraphine's composure finally crumbled completely as guards moved to restrain her, her earlier fierce confidence dissolving into something more desperate and afraid. This is not finished, she called out as she was led from the chamber, though her words carried little of their former conviction. My family has allies you do not yet know about. This will not end simply because you have won today. Draven watched her removal with a grim expression, clearly understanding that Seraphine's warning, however desperate, likely held some truth. The conspiracy that had nearly cost him his throne and Alira her life had been years in the making, and rooting out every thread of it would take considerably longer than a single dramatic confrontation in the council chamber. But for now, in this immediate moment, the most pressing danger had passed, and Draven turned back to Alira, his expression softening from the hard authority of a king dealing with treason into something far more personal and raw. You could have died today, he said quietly, pulling her fully into his arms despite the dozens of witnesses still present in the chamber. That blade was at your throat, Alira, if whatever power surfaced in you had not awakened when it did. But it did, Alira said, resting against him, feeling the adrenaline of the past hour finally beginning to drain from her body, leaving exhaustion and lingering fear in its place. I'm here, Draven. We're both here, we survived it. I have never in my life felt fear like I felt in that moment, Draven admitted, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. Watching that blade against your throat, understanding I could not reach you in time to prevent whatever was about to happen. I have faced armies, Alira, faced assassination attempts against my own life, without this kind of terror. But watching you in danger, that was different. That was unbearable. I felt it too, Alira admitted, the fear, but underneath it, something else. Something that felt like it had been waiting my whole life for exactly that moment to finally wake up. Marian approached them carefully, her expression thoughtful as she studied Alira with newfound curiosity and respect. If the old stories hold any truth, she said, your power will likely continue growing now that it has awakened, Your Grace. The Spirit Fire bloodline was known, in the old texts, for a connection to fate and instinct, beyond what typical shifters possess. It may explain why the bond formed with you despite your inability to shift. Perhaps the old codes were not simply wrong to exclude wolfless women from the choosing ritual. Perhaps they simply never understood what a wolfless woman might actually be capable of. Alira absorbed this new understanding slowly, feeling something shift fundamentally in how she understood her own life, her own worth. For 18 years, she had been told, in countless cruel ways, that the absence of a wolf made her less than whole, less than worthy, less than human in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Standing now in a council chamber that had just witnessed her reveal an ancient power thought extinct, she understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that she had never actually been missing anything at all. She had simply been waiting to discover what she truly was. I am not wolfless, she said slowly, testing the words, feeling their truth settle over her like a mantle finally fitting properly after years of ill-fitting expectations. I was never wolfless, I was simply something the old codes never bothered to understand. Draven's hand found hers, his expression full of something that looked remarkably like awe, alongside the fierce protectiveness that had characterized their entire relationship since that first night in Blackthorn's hall. "You are extraordinary," he said quietly. "You have always been extraordinary, Alira. It only took the rest of the world time to catch up to what my wolf recognized the moment I first caught your scent." Around them, the council chamber slowly returned to some semblance of order, guards finishing the removal of the conspirators, council members beginning the difficult conversations about how to address the treason that had just been exposed so dramatically within their own ranks. But for Alira, standing amid the aftermath, with Draven's hand steady in hers, the immediate danger had passed, replaced by a new understanding of herself that felt, for the first time in her entire life, like coming fully home to who she had always been meant to become. The tournament that day was cancelled, replaced instead by urgent council sessions addressing the conspiracy and its aftermath, but Alira barely noticed the change in plans, too consumed by the enormity of everything that had shifted within her over the course of a single terrifying, transformative morning. She had arrived at that council chamber as a wolfless queen, still uncertain of her place in a world built for shifters. She left it as something else entirely, something ancient and powerful that the old codes had simply forgotten how to recognize. Whatever remained of Seraphine's conspiracy, whatever allies still lurked unseen as the fallen noblewoman had warned, Alira understood now that she would face them not as someone missing a fundamental piece of herself, but as someone finally beginning to understand the true shape of her own strength. The days following the confrontation in the council chamber brought a flurry of activity throughout the palace, as Draven's advisors worked to fully unravel the conspiracy that had nearly claimed both his throne and Alira's life. Seraphine and the captured conspirators were held in the palace's secure chambers, awaiting formal judgment before the full council, while investigators worked to trace every remaining thread of the plot that had been building. It now seemed clear, for years longer than anyone had initially suspected. Alira spent those days in a strange, suspended state, adjusting simultaneously to the aftermath of nearly losing her life and to the profound revelation about her own nature that had emerged in that same terrifying moment. Marian had begun teaching her what fragments remained of the old stories about the Spiritfire bloodline, ancient texts that had survived in the palace's extensive library, despite centuries of the ruling codes dismissing wolfless women as fundamentally lesser. The stories say the Spiritfire bloodline was once as respected as any shifter lineage, Marian explained one afternoon, the two of them seated in a quiet corner of the palace library, surrounded by carefully preserved scrolls. Before the current codes were written, before power became so tightly defined by the ability to shift, women of your bloodline served as protectors and healers, their connection to something beyond the physical form valued rather than feared. "Why did that change?" Alira asked, tracing her fingers over the faded script of an ancient text she could not fully read. "Fear, mostly," Marian said. "Power that cannot be easily controlled or understood tends to frighten those who hold conventional authority. Over generations, as fewer Spiritfire bloodlines survived and shifter power became increasingly centralized, the old codes were rewritten to exclude anyone who could not shift, dismissing abilities like yours as myth or superstition, rather than acknowledging a different, equally valid form of strength." Alira absorbed this history slowly, feeling the weight of generations of erased knowledge settling around her. She was not simply an anomaly, a strange exception to otherwise absolute rules. She was, potentially, the last remnant of an entire bloodline that had once held honored status before being systematically forgotten and dismissed. Her growing understanding of her own power coincided with a deepening intimacy between herself and Draven, the danger they had faced together in the council chamber, having stripped away much of the careful reserve that had characterized their earlier interactions. He sought her counsel now, not merely as his intended queen, but as a partner whose judgment and strength he had come to rely upon completely, and Alira found herself, for the first time in her entire life, existing in a relationship built on genuine mutual respect, rather than the constant power imbalances that had defined every previous connection in her life. "I have been thinking," Draven told her one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens under a sky heavy with stars, about what this power means for the future of this territory, beyond simply the immediate danger we faced. If the Spirit Fire bloodline was once honored, perhaps it is time the old codes were reconsidered entirely, not merely to accommodate you, but to properly recognize forms of strength that shifter culture has spent generations dismissing. That would be a significant change, Illyra said carefully. The council members who survived the conspiracy, the ones who remained loyal, they still hold traditional views about what constitutes proper strength and worth. Changing the codes would face resistance, even now. Change often does, Draven said. But I did not become king by avoiding difficult decisions simply because they proved unpopular with entrenched interests. You have shown this entire territory that Wolfless does not mean worthless, Illyra. I believe it is time our laws finally reflected that truth. The formal trial of Seraphine and her conspirators took place a week after the confrontation, conducted before the full council in a proceeding markedly more sober than the chaos that had erupted during the initial exposure of their plot. Evidence was presented methodically, Finn's testimony corroborated by additional witnesses who had come forward once the conspiracy's collapse made speaking the truth considerably safer than it had been during the plot's active operation. Seraphine, stripped of her earlier defiant confidence, sat through much of the proceeding with a hollow, defeated expression, her family's ambitions having led ultimately to complete disgrace, rather than the power they had sought for generations. When finally given opportunity to speak in her own defense, she offered little beyond bitter acknowledgement of what her pride and her family's old grievances had cost her. I believed I deserved this position, she said quietly, addressing the council, rather than looking at Illyra or Draven directly. I was raised my entire life believing my bloodline, my training, my beauty entitled me to become queen. Watching that position given instead to a wolfless servant girl felt like the deepest possible insult, not merely to me, but to everything I had been taught to value. I understand now how wrong that belief was. It does not undo what I attempted, but I wanted it acknowledged before this council, regardless of what judgment follows. The council's judgment, delivered after careful deliberation, stripped the Vance family of their noble title and lands, exiling the surviving conspirators from the territory entirely, rather than imposing the execution that treason traditionally warranted, a mercy Draven himself had argued for, despite the severity of their crimes. Execution would satisfy immediate justice, he explained to Illyra privately, after the judgment had been delivered, but exile allows for the possibility, however small, that reflection and consequence might eventually produce genuine remorse, rather than simply ending lives that, however corrupted by ambition, still held some capacity for change. That's remarkably generous, Illyra said, after everything they attempted against you, against both of us. Perhaps, Draven acknowledged, or perhaps I have simply learned, through knowing you, that people are rarely as simply defined as their worst actions suggest. I do not forgive what Seraphine attempted. But I can choose mercy over vengeance, particularly with you beside me, reminding me that strength does not always require cruelty to prove itself. With the conspiracy formally resolved and the immediate danger addressed, the palace slowly began settling back into a rhythm that felt, for the first time since Illyra's arrival, genuinely peaceful rather than tensely watchful. Callum arrived from Blackthorn shortly after the trial's conclusion, having traveled with a small escort Draven had arranged weeks earlier, and Illyra's reunion with her brother, tearful and overwhelming, provided a welcome reminder of the life and family she had carried with her through every difficult transformation of the preceding months. You look different, Callum told her, studying her with the careful attention of someone who had known her his entire life. Not just the dresses, or the way you carry yourself now, something deeper than that. I found out something about myself, Illyra told him, and over the following days, she explained everything that had happened, the conspiracy, the attack, the awakening of her ancient power, watching her brother's expression shift from concern to amazement as the full scope of her transformation became clear. So you were never actually wolfless, Callum said slowly, absorbing the revelation. This whole time, everyone back in Blackthorn who called you worthless, who treated you like you were less than everyone else, they were simply too ignorant to recognize what you actually were. It seems that way, Illyra agreed. Though I understand now that even without this power, I was never actually worthless, Callum. I survived everything Blackthorn threw at me for 18 years, using nothing but my own determination and resilience. This power is remarkable, certainly, but it did not make me worthy. I was always worthy. I simply had to stop believing what cruel people told me about myself. Callum's eyes were bright with emotion as he pulled her into another embrace. I always believed in you, he said, even when you didn't believe in yourself. I know, Elira said softly. That belief carried me through more difficult days than you probably realize. With her brother settled comfortably in the capital, beginning training with the palace guard as Draven had originally offered, and the conspiracy that had threatened everything finally resolved, Elira found herself, for the first time since that fateful night in Blackthorn's great hall, able to look forward, rather than constantly bracing against whatever danger might come next. The formal coronation, delayed by the crisis with Seraphine's family, was finally scheduled to take place within the month, and Elira approached the preparation with a confidence that would have seemed impossible to the frightened, uncertain servant girl who had first arrived at this palace so many months earlier. She was no longer simply surviving her new life. She had begun, finally, to truly claim it. The morning of the coronation arrived clear and bright, the mountains surrounding the capital, catching the early sunlight in a way that felt, to Elira, almost symbolic of everything that had changed since her arrival at this palace. She stood in her chambers, dressed in a gown of deep silver and blue, the ashgrave colors woven with subtle threads that caught the light whenever she moved, and studied her reflection in the tall mirror, with an expression far different from the uncertain, disbelieving stare she had offered that same mirror months earlier. You are ready, Marion said, adjusting the final details of Elira's appearance with the careful attention she had brought to every aspect of Elira's transformation since that first frightened night after the choosing ritual. More ready than any queen I have prepared in all my years of service to this house. I don't feel like the same person who arrived here, Elira admitted, turning slightly to study her reflection from another angle. Everything about me feels different now, stronger, more certain of who I actually am. That is because you are different, Marion said gently. You have earned every bit of strength and certainty you carry today, Elira. Not through birth, not through inherited privilege, but through surviving cruelty that would have broken lesser spirits, and through choosing courage again and again when fear would have been so much easier. Elira thought of Blackthorn as she waited for the ceremony to begin, of Garrick's knife pressed against her throat behind the grain house, of Seraphine's cutting words at the fountain, of every moment throughout her entire life when she had been told, in ways both subtle and overt, that she was less than whole, less than worthy, less than human. She thought of Callum's unwavering belief in her, of her father's quiet love before his death, of the small kindnesses that had somehow sustained her through years when the world offered little else. And she thought, finally, of Draven, standing in Blackthorn's great hall those months ago, stepping toward the Wolfless servant girl nobody else in that glittering room would even look at directly, declaring before an entire skeptical pack that fate had chosen her, despite every law and expectation, insisting such a bond was impossible. The great hall of the Ashgrave Palace had been transformed for the coronation, banners bearing both the wolf sigil of the royal house and a new symbol Draven had commissioned specifically for this occasion, flames rendered in silver thread, representing the spirit fire bloodline that Elira's power had revealed to an entire territory that had spent generations dismissing such strength as myth. Elira walked down the long aisle toward the throne, where Draven waited, dressed in formal regalia that could not fully hide the warmth in his expression as he watched her approach. The assembled nobility, servants, and guests filled every available space in the hall, a sea of faces that included, remarkably, representatives from Blackthorn itself, sent to witness the formal recognition of the Wolfless girl their pack had once dismissed as worthless. She caught sight of Callum near the front of the gathered crowd, dressed in the simple uniform of a palace guard trainee, his face bright with pride as he watched his sister walk toward her formal crowning. Beside him stood Daphne, promoted now to oversee the palace kitchens after her loyalty during the crisis with Seraphine's conspiracy, and Finn, whose courage in coming forward had earned him a permanent position within Draven's personal guard. When Elira reached the throne, Draven stepped forward to meet her, taking her hands in his, with a tenderness that belied the formal solemnity of the occasion. "Illyra Voss," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "Born without the ability to shift, dismissed by an entire pack as wolfless and worthless. You have proven yourself the bearer of a strength this territory had forgotten how to recognize. You have shown courage in the face of cruelty, wisdom in the face of conspiracy, and a compassion for those overlooked by traditional power that has already begun transforming how this court understands worth and strength." He lifted the crown, crafted specifically for this moment, silver and blue stones arranged in patterns that echoed both the wolf sigil of his house and the flame symbol representing her own awakened power, and placed it carefully upon her head. "I crown you not merely as my queen through fate's bond," Draven continued, "but as an equal partner in leading this territory forward. Someone whose strength stands independent of any title or bond. Someone this entire court, and every territory under our protection, will come to understand as worthy of profound respect." The hall erupted into applause and cheering, a response so different from the skeptical, resentful silence that had greeted Illyra's arrival at this same palace months earlier, that she felt tears gathering despite her best efforts to maintain composure befitting the occasion. She looked out over the assembled crowd, at faces that had once regarded her with suspicion, now offering genuine warmth and respect, and understood that this moment represented something far larger than her own personal triumph. It represented proof that worth could not be measured by the narrow, exclusionary rules an entire society had built around a single form of power. It represented the possibility that anyone dismissed as lesser, anyone told they lacked what mattered most, might carry within them a strength the world simply had not yet learned to recognize. Later that evening, after the formal ceremonies had concluded and the celebratory feast had wound down into quieter conversations among lingering guests, Illyra found herself standing once again in the palace gardens with Draven, the same location where they had first spoken honestly about the fears and uncertainties shadowing their unusual bond. "We did it," she said softly, looking up at the star-filled sky stretching above the mountains. "We survived the conspiracy, exposed the truth, and now, somehow, I'm actually queen of this entire territory." "You did far more than survive," Draven said, pulling her gently against his side as they walked along the familiar garden paths. "You transformed what this territory believes possible, Illyra. The Council has already begun discussions about revising the old codes, recognizing bloodlines and forms of strength beyond simple shifting ability. Word of what happened here has begun spreading to neighboring territories as well. You have started something that will likely outlast both of our lifetimes." "I never wanted to change the entire world," Illyra admitted. "I only wanted to survive Blackthorn, to protect my brother, to find some small measure of peace in a life that had offered me very little of it." "And yet here you stand," Draven said, "having done far more than you ever imagined possible, precisely because you refused to accept the limitations everyone else tried imposing upon you. That refusal, more than any ancient power or fated bond, is what I fell in love with, Illyra, long before I fully understood what you were capable of." Illyra turned to face him fully, searching his expression in the moonlight. "You love me," she said, something warm and overwhelming filling her chest at hearing the words spoken so directly for what felt like the first time, despite months of growing intimacy between them. "I have loved you," Draven said, "since long before either of us understood what our bond truly meant, since watching you stand in that council chamber, refusing to break despite every cruelty aimed against you. Since learning that a wolfless servant girl possessed more courage and integrity than nobles trained their entire lives to hold power. I love you, Illyra Voss. Not because fate demanded it, not because of any bond or prophecy, but because of exactly who you have proven yourself to be." "I love you too," Illyra said, and the words felt, finally, completely true, free of any lingering uncertainty about whether she belonged in this strange, transformed life she had never expected to claim. "I think I have for longer than I let myself admit." They stood together in the quiet garden, the celebration continuing faintly in the distance, the crown still resting upon Illyra's head, symbol of everything she had overcome, and everything still ahead of them both. The girl once called wolfless and worthless had become something far greater than anyone, including herself, had ever dared imagine. Not despite what made her different, but precisely because of it. The pack that had once dismissed her, the court that had once doubted her, the world that had once insisted she was less than whole, all of them had learned, in the end, exactly how wrong they had been. And somewhere in the northern mountains, in a small settlement called Blackthorn, a girl born without a wolf would never again be told that her worth depended on something she was born without. The old codes were changing, the old cruelties were finally being questioned. And Lyra Voss, once worthless in the eyes of everyone who mattered, now stood as living proof that fate recognized strength the rest of the world had simply forgotten how to see. Her story, once dismissed before it had even properly begun, had become instead a beginning for countless others still waiting to discover exactly what they themselves might be capable of becoming.